Now this is the return bout. Late last year, Lindsay Tanner decided he could interview me, and which seemed to go down pretty well because it was one of the most watched videos on the Wheelers Centre website. So the incentives for me are a bit wonky tonight. I don't want you to watch Lindsay's book to the same extent you watched mine. Anyway, no, we don't think that at all. Now, I'll just begin by pointing out that we're here obviously to talk about Sideshow, which is the dumbing down of democracy by Lindsay Tanner, published by Scribe. And Henry Rosenblum's just pointed out that you went reprint on the second day of publication, or was it the first? First day of publication. So it's flying off the bookshelves, and it also flew off the newsstands too, because we had a bit of an issue at the beginning of it. Now, I just want to read a line from the book. Lindsay made a prediction about how his book would be received, and I don't think he appreciated how good a prediction it was. Given the Sideshow syndrome, I know that most political journalists will quickly scan this book looking for shock revelations about the inner workings of the Rudd government. I mean, we'll get some tonight because we're not going to let him off that lightly tonight. They'll search for attacks on my former colleagues, and they'll look for diverting anecdotes from inside the cabinet room. I can save them the bother. They'll find none of those things here. So how did that one go for you?
Well, I underestimated the creativity of the average low-rent political journalist, I'm afraid. So Sam Maiden ran this article which appeared in various tabloids under some interesting headlines that usually did have things like Tanner attacks and Tanner targets and stuff like that, with 3 or 4 very carefully selected tiny bits out of the book that just happened to be capable of being manipulated into looking vaguely like I was criticising Kevin Rudd or criticising Julia Gillard, which I wasn't, and then were presented in this way. And the Rudd government's failure to proceed with its proposed business advisory panel chaired by Sir Rod Eddington, which was announced in opposition and ultimately didn't happen, this was described as a deception, which of course it was nothing of the sort. And there was just a general, I thought, spectacular effort made to distort the nature of what I'd written to make it, to bang it into a particular shape, and a classic example of the frames syndrome. So Tanner attacks Liberals, that's not a story. Tanner attacks media, that's a sort of story maybe for the Australian, but not in tabloid world. Tanner attacks Kevin Rudd, that's a story. And if we can find somewhere that there's a sentence with the words Kevin Rudd in it, then there's a fair chance we'll be able to make that into a Tanner attacks Kevin Rudd story. And essentially that's what happened.
And of course, as we pointed out, so good was the publicity that we went in reprint on the first day. So thank you, Samantha.
Oh, well, I should add that I'm not really complaining about it.
Now, walk me through the process. You were collecting anecdotes for this book, collecting material for this book before you went to government. So this didn't begin as a whinge about the trials and tribulations of the media age when you were in government. You were thinking about this beforehand, but I understand you also thought it was not necessarily all my fault, but the fault of my craft at the start, and I think your views evolved since then.
Yeah, no, look, if you actually look at, if you can be bothered to look at the references in the book, you'll see that there is a kind of point in about mid-07 where what you might call the primary sources start, and that in a sense is roughly about the time when originally I probably had in mind to do something like a quarterly essay or something like that, and I thought, well, I'll just start keeping these things because I was becoming more and more conscious of this problem. I've been saying to people for years, I'm in the entertainment business. And they'd look at me quizzically and then I'd explain to them. So I started just to gather bits and pieces, and then a year or two later I started to actually read some secondary source material and take a few notes and so forth. But initially I was angry at the media. So initially I was just frustrated and angry about the fact that serious stuff was happening, big decisions being made, big debates, big arguments, and these issues were less and less being connected by the media to the wider population. And in their place, we had not just the usual sensationalising and gotcha journalism and distortion, but also this widening phenomenon of politics being presented as a circus. and politicians responding in order to get publicity by behaving as if they were in a circus, and that just made me angry. But eventually, the more I got into this, the more I started to realise, well, actually, the media aren't, kind of deliberately orchestrating this. They are reacting to commercial pressures. And the commercial pressures say that Sirius is boring. But, Barnaby Joyce making a song and dance and, going red in the face and yelling at people, or somebody calling somebody Colonel Gaddafi or whatever, well, that's mildly interesting. So, or somebody like me going on the footy show and clowning around, that's mildly interesting. So eventually I realised that this is no one's fault. This is just a broad systemic problem where journalism and politics are kind of locked in this death embrace and sort of spiralling downwards.
Now, can we get a definition of media? Because in the book you use the phrase broadly, but there's obviously many bits to the media, and there's obviously been a change in the technology, so the mediums have multiplied. So walk me through your thoughts on that.
Look, I think it would probably be true to say that essentially I'm talking about what we used to call the mass media. Obviously that's morphing and evolving, and you're now getting a wider range of, at this point, niche products and outlets and mechanisms for dissemination of information and content, and some of them now, of course, are much more interactive than the traditional passive broadcasting kind of or newsprint kind of model. So it's essentially about the traditional mass media. One of the, I think, the really interesting things is that the competition and the challenge from the new media is probably the central factor in driving the sideshow syndrome, and whether or not it will ultimately be the solution, which I think some more upbeat people think, I think is very much in doubt. It's not clear, because yes, out on the internet, out in digital land, there are all kinds of fantastic new products with high quality commentary, blogs, even some stuff on pay TV and whatever. The trouble is that that is talking to the engaged, educated minority. And the problem is that until you've actually got a mechanism for engaging the bulk of the population in a political conversation about the major issues of the day, which we used to have and which I think is slowly diminishing, then you've got a problem.
From the position of government, did you still view the television news as the primary outlet for your message?
Well, I didn't, but everyone else did, which is a bit of a problem because it made me seem a bit odd.
But is that, I mean, just talk me through the metrics. Is that still the way a government looks at the media? 6 o'clock news is the first and foremost.
Oh, absolutely. It is a complete obsession. All of the nonsense that you all see, or those of you who are interested enough to glance at it, that you see in Question Time, is driven by one thing only. That is performance art for the 6 o'clock news. And everybody is engaged in an attempt to get their party or themselves that 30 seconds of mass publicity on the Channel 9 News or the Channel 7 News or whatever. That's all it is. And that's why people stand up there and wave around big placards or bring cardboard cutouts of Kevin Rudd into Question Time or into the Parliament. All of that stuff you see that all looks so childish, it is happening for one reason, and that is that's what gets on the 6 o'clock news. So it is all straight performance art. Now, I think the obsession with the 6 o'clock news is antiquated. It's kind of 1980s thinking. And, of course, the number of people watching the 6 o'clock news as a proportion of the total population is substantially lower than it used to be. But insiders, staffers, politicians, at the end of the working day, they're all talking about, who won the news, what happened on the news, who did that get up, did this get up? And it is a complete obsession.
Now, who won the news? Could you theoretically win 364 out of the 65 days of a year and still lose an election? I mean, I've always been struggling with this concept of winning the news if winning the news meant you needed a different line every night. Does the public get confused when you try that approach?
Well, possibly yes, and I think it is an example of what I dubbed a few years ago the politics of the moment, where everything is focused on the micro battle that is right in front of you, which is about today is about what the media is running, or are running rather, now, and in particular what's on the 6 o'clock news and the spillover kind of reporting in the major newspapers, which in turn triggers radio and stuff, where everything is focused on that here and now micro battle. And whatever you have to do to win that battle or to minimise damage, you do. And if whatever you're doing has some negative consequences for down the track, well, that's down the track. You worry about that then. And that mentality is pretty well universal.
Could I get you to think about the 2007 election year, and it was a very long year, and the first year of government? Was it easier in opposition to yell at the Howard government in its 11th year, or was it easier in government to put a message out?
Look,
given the things you're describing, it strikes me that opposition is an easier job today than it might have been 10 or 20 years ago, where someone like myself could demand a policy from an opposition leader, and an opposition leader felt obliged to deliver one.
Look, I think it's a mixed position. In some cases, opposition's now harder, but I think in a sense, and I think Tony Abbott's benefiting from this, the period when oppositions were told you have got to produce, the equivalent of next year's budget in your commitments, spending, taxing, etc., in order to be seen as credible. I think thankfully there has been some retreat from that kind of craziness. So I think in some respects, yes, oppositions do get it easier, but it's very, very difficult to compare. And what happens is that if you get on a roll, then everything goes your way. So we were on a roll in 2007, and therefore there's a kind of momentum that is essentially the way the media looks at you. People talk about momentum in politics. Well, that's just code for which way the media wind is blowing. That's all it is. That's what momentum is. And once you get that momentum rolling, then basically people won't really be looking for ways to trip you up, because they're going with the momentum, and that typically happens. Now, there'll always be one or two outliers who, because the perceived wisdom is that, Kevin Rudd's going to beat John Howard and he's kicking goals, they want to trip him up. But typically people act like a herd, and the media will minimise the attempts to really blow up whoever's got the momentum, or they will criticise in a way that actually doesn't hurt the party concerned. So this is one of the key things that I think people overlook. I had this debate with my then advisor when Mark Latham broke the taxi driver's arm, this was on the front page of the Sunday Age from memory, and presumably the equivalent in Sydney. And my advisor said, "Oh, he's finished. His career's over." And I said, "No way known. A lot more people now know who he is." And there's a few people out there who probably agree with him, that breaking taxi drivers' arms is not such a bad thing. And those who don't agree with it and think it's outrageous, well, probably they were never going to support him anyway. And so the truth is that actually getting criticised is not always a bad thing. If you're trying to sell books, for example, I'd much rather people wrote critical articles about my book than ignored it. If they really want to hurt me, ignore it. But attack away, go for it. Fantastic.
Hence the Sunday Telegraph's boost to your sales.
Yeah, indeed.
Now, you refer obliquely to Kevin Rudd's governing motto, which was, and I can tell you from the horse's mouth, not from Lindsay's, not even from the book, but the way Kevin Rudd viewed the media, if you didn't feed it, it would eat you. So a government did have to turn up every day. That was obviously the way he operated, but it meant that you all operated that way. So almost from the day you came into power, in the end of November 2007, you're in this continuous campaigning. Now, I'll just point out that the concept of continuous campaigning wasn't invented by Kevin Rudd. John Howard practiced it, and they practice it in the US, and they've been doing it for a few years. And most of the trends we pick up from the Americans. But there was something almost unique about the Kevin experiment, and I've often wondered whether our system needed to try that version of the always-on Prime Minister who was there for every arm of the media. You know, you'd see him on the news, he'd be on FM radio, he'd be on talkback radio, he'd be tweeting, there'd be a blog running. Just walk me through the demands of government and the daily messaging to try and win that each particular day.
Well, I don't think it's perhaps as unusual as you might think. So I think from memory I quote Philip Gould in the book, who was Tony Blair's pollster, and a quote that is almost identical to the one that you've just relayed, which says, if you don't feed the media constantly, the beast eats you up. So I think this is a global phenomenon. And I think the feeling with politicians is that there is a space there, that you can't have a blank front page of a newspaper. Channel 9 are not going to cancel their 6 o'clock news bulletin because they've got nothing worth saying. So one way or another, there is a volume of content that is going to go out there, and of course the variety of outlets and therefore the sort of total volume that has to be filled has increased substantially, and therefore from a politician's perspective, if you're not fighting to fill up that space, then it's not very likely that it's going to be filled up by others in your favour, and fairly likely it'll be filled up to your disadvantage. Now, it's more complex than that, and I would suggest to you that the picture with respect to Kevin Rudd's media approach is a little bit more nuanced than what you've suggested. So, for example, I can remember a number of radio announcers complaining that he'd refused to come on for months and months. So I think it was a little bit more modulated than the just go everywhere all the time. But to conclude on this core question, the thing that I found troubling, and I'm sure it's the same in the Liberal Party, and it was the same for us in opposition, particularly in the latter part of opposition, is just how everything is subsumed within this media frame where you start to think differently. So instead of asking yourself, as you're sitting around a table developing a policy or dealing with an issue or trying to reform some aspect of Australian society or whatever, crafting a budget, more and more what you're doing is asking, how will this look? Not, is this the right thing? So more and more governance is actually about appearance manipulation and less about genuine content. Now, the two will always be there. So, manipulation of appearances, theatrics, performance art, that has been part of democratic politics since ancient Greece. My argument is that that is now taking over, and hence you get my new favourite noun, the announceable. Now, I don't remember, I think I first heard the word announceable in about 07 from memory, but if anybody can find an earlier sort of example of this...
That's a Kevinism, announceable, isn't it?
I've got no idea. In fact, I think it's probably the good subject for a PhD, if there's anybody in the audience who's looking for an etymology PhD, this is a ripper. But that says it all. So what an announceable is a device for looking like you're doing something. Now, I'd argue that John Howard perfected the look like you're doing something strategy, and that politics changed, I think, noticeably in this country from the late 90s into the early 2000s. And he perfected this strategy of having every base covered. So no matter what question he was asked, what are you doing about problem X, or why haven't you done something here or there, he would always have in his back pocket an answer which went something like, we are spending $28 million over 4 years on the blah, 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 meaningless acronym program. And that was kind of the end of the story. And the question, this thing's moving by itself, and maybe I'm talking too loud, the question of whether this announceable had any merit at all, have any impact on the problem or the issue, is kind of too complicated and secondary for the media to dig into. And so you have this kind of endless process of minor announcements. And I'll give you a classic example. We counted, in opposition, 18 different Howard government broadband programs, all designed basically to pretend that they were doing something. Meanwhile, Australia's falling further and further behind in relative terms on broadband because there were fundamental structural issues they weren't dealing with. And so they had this kind of set of defences about, whenever they get challenged about this, well, we've got the Broadband Connect program and we've got the U-Butte broadband program and the this broadband program and so on, bamboozling everybody. So Howard perfected that. And we inherited a lot of this stuff, and we weren't pure either. And you look around the States and you'll see the same phenomenon. This is why the Prime Minister's Energy Efficiency Task Force counted up something like 300 separate programs across Australia, state and federal, designed to promote energy efficiency. 300.
Is that what burned you out as Finance Minister, counting them all up?
Yes. Well, I used to rant and rave occasionally about this because it is just ludicrous that you've got this pattern of governance emerging. But the important thing to understand is, why is this happening? And the answer is, this is politicians responding to a media context, responding to the need to be there when media outlets are getting less and less enamoured of having politicians there in the first place, responding to the need to defend themselves against mendacious attack because, humiliating a politician, humiliating a government, exposing something is, of course, vaguely exciting and interesting content. And therefore, if it isn't real, you manufacture it. And so politicians then in turn have to defend themselves against that. And of course what Howard perfected was the kind of preemptive defence where you've always got an answer to an accusation that you're doing nothing about the dental health of Aboriginal kids or whatever. There's always something to reach to. Meanwhile, the process of actually running the country and improving the country suffers because you're engaged in a giant theatrical performance more so than in actually doing things.
But when did you feel that you had to turn up every day? You've been in Parliament. You were in Parliament between 1993 and 2010. So you came in at the end of that big reform period, at the tail end of a recession, and you've got roughly 2 decades of experience. When did this idea of having something new to say every day become part of government? And also, to relate this question to the other curse on national affairs, which is the focus group, when did government and opposition go to a focus group to ask the punters what they should believe in, i.e. what a government should believe in? Are those two trends, do you think those two trends fused at some point?
I think they did, and I think it's hard to identify a time. And of course, when you're in the middle of these things, one of the problems is you tend not to notice. And so every now and then, because I became kind of a bit obsessed by this stuff, I would feel myself slipping into the manipulation of appearances zone and ignoring actual policy issues and how to achieve better outcomes. And I'd kind of slap myself on the wrist and say, wake up, you're being stupid. But it's incredibly insidious. But focus groups have a role. Focus groups are the classic good servant, bad master. If as a government or indeed an opposition you have a values base, a set of beliefs, and you build on that a policy edifice, and you test what you're proposing to do or what you're thinking of with properly run focus groups, that's actually pretty democratic, because what you're doing is trying to get representative samples of genuine, ordinary community opinion to kind of get a sense of what people think, and that can actually guide you. And you shouldn't disparage focus groups because they're basically the voters. Now, there are methodological questions about how accurate they are, and this bizarre obsession with Western Sydney that the political class seems to have, as if there are no other place in Australia that's where all the voters are. There are things that distort it. But properly run focus group processes, which are informing your decision making, are perfectly legitimate and reasonable. The problem is that when you do the kind of Jim Hacker, I am their leader, I must follow them kind of routine, and say, well, what do you want us to say today? that's when it gets mad. And that's when you end up with in the world of Announcables, where it goes something like this. What's on your mind, folks? Cost of living. This has gone up, that's gone up, or we're really angry and whatever. And you go away and think, ooh, they're a bit upset about cost of living. What can we do about that?
Fuel watch.
Well, funny you should mention that.
Yeah. Because I actually want you to connect the dots here, because I know what you're talking about, but you're not going to get away with saying, people do this. This is something your government did.
Fuel watch and grocery watch were examples of that whole thing. And the problem with something like that is to do substantial things that actually have an impact on the cost of living involves things that are abstract, longer term, and very removed from a day-to-day media discourse. So do you know what will improve the cost of living in the longer term? Investment in skills, investment in infrastructure, regulatory reform, improvements in productivity, which are ultimately pretty well the entire story, with improvements in living standards. But when people are just yelling about, petrol prices, grocery prices, this, that and the other, it sounds like a pretty lame response to say, we're investing for the longer term to improve things or whatever. It doesn't answer the question. And so you get driven by the intensity of that pressure into the world of fuel watch and grocery watch.
Now, what happened to Kevin Rudd with the longest winning streak in opinion poll history to go from that to being dismissed just before his first re-election?
Well, I think there's a bit of a lesson in that, amongst other things, about how public opinion can move around very quickly. Few people will remember this, but Mike Rann, who is still Premier of South Australia, about 3 or 4 months before he got elected as Premier, quite some time ago now, he had, I think, a positive approval rating as opposition leader of about 30% or something, and there was still, an election was in sight, and there were still murmurings within the media and the Labor Party about possibly knocking him off, and he was a bit of a liability and so forth. But nonetheless, to his credit, he managed to win an election. And then within about 3 months, he was on 70%. So with not a great deal happening in the intervening period, he'd gone from 30% to 70%. Other than the legitimising factor of actually becoming the state premier. So these approval ratings can move around dramatically, very quickly, and of course people live or die by them. But I think in Kevin's case, that's the opposite example. But he went from having stellar ratings to being in serious trouble in a pretty quick period of time.
And why did that happen?
Well, I'm not really going to go into that, because I'm setting myself up as a commentator on the media, not on my colleagues or anything like that. And I think to be honest, it's actually very difficult to say. People have their theories and their arguments, and usually what happens is that people trot out theories that suit their own view of the world. So if you read Dennis Shanahan in your paper, for example, he'll have a particular take on events which usually just happen to accidentally connect with his view of the world. Read Christopher Pearson, it's even more sort of interesting. And equally, you'll get others from different perspectives. So I don't purport to have a simple explanation of that. It's pretty obvious that the government got into political difficulties in the fight over the mining tax, for example. That you don't have to be a psephologist or a genius to work that one out. But the exact contours of that and how that played out in public opinion, very hard to say.
Now, I've in the reply to the quarterly essay, I've sworn I wouldn't mention a poll this year, and I'm not going to mention a poll this year because it's 2011. Here's how I'm going to sneak out of that one.
Good to hear.
In early 2010, Kevin Rudd had a poll that was almost identical to a poll John Howard had at the equivalent point in the first term of the Howard government, which is mid-1998. And you probably remember the period. Pauline Hanson almost took the balance of power at the first attempt at the Queensland state election in June that year, and John Howard had an approval rating roughly 10 points less than the Liberal parties. So he was at 20-something and the Liberal Party was at 30-something. See, I'm not quoting directly from a poll, I'm alluding to one, but from a long time ago, so I haven't broken my vow. Why would a Labor government not remember that history towards the end of the first term of the Rudd government, that they didn't think that there was a chance at a second term with Kevin in the chair? Now, this is I don't want you to tell me why his approval rating went down 30 points, but we had some pretty good history in the past that you would hang on to a leader.
Look, I think that's an interesting analogy, and probably in some respects a better one than the one I used in the book, which is with Paul Keating in 1995, where we were in a very strong position politically. This was my first term in Parliament. End of 94, we were really strong. Kicking goals, the Libs were a mess, Alexander Downer's leadership was falling apart, and then John Howard became leader in late January 95. Some bad things happened then, and we went way down and never recovered. And apart from the odd, very isolated rumbling, there was no serious attempt or suggestion that Keating should be replaced. Now, there's some obvious differences. This was a government very much at the tail end of its life rather than a first term, hence the Howard analogy may be more appropriate. But I think the answer is that the whole world has speeded up. And so everybody is much less patient, and there's this kind of instant gratification dynamic that you can now sense throughout our society, which is, okay, well, he's now in political trouble, bang, you're dead. And
there are only a couple of polls, though.
Well, but in a funny kind, I can't remember exactly how many, but certainly it seemed like a relatively brief period. But in a funny kind of way, if you want a counterfactual to this, which I think is a really interesting one, that's Ted Baillieu. Ted Baillieu was kind of dead meat for an extended period of time. He had his own party running Sack Ted Baillieu websites and all this kind of madness. And for an extended period, I think probably only the lack of an even remotely viable alternative probably kept him in the position. And about 6 weeks before the November 27 state election last year, I was talking to somebody, I've got a witness, who was saying, oh, look, Brumby will get back in pretty comfortably. And I said, no, look, I actually think this is going to be line ball. And on balance, governments in that position, tend to scrape home. And I think it deserves to be re-elected. But I think we're going to get the fright of our lives, and it's going to be really tough. And one of the key reasons is that people are now giving Ted Baillieu credit for hanging in there. And they're starting to think, well, maybe there's a bit more to this guy than I thought, because he's been put through the ringer with all this stuff and he's still standing. And so that's the kind of counterfactual that if you can manage to get through that impatience and the heat of the fire for a period of time, then you probably do come out stronger, because people sort of perversely give you credit for hanging in there.
Now, the history is pretty straightforward. Kevin Rudd was the first Prime Minister of the modern era that didn't have a 20-year career in public life before he became Prime Minister. Now, there's a small difference in how you interpret Bob Hawke's time, because he's only in Parliament for 3 years before he became Prime Minister, but he'd been ACT President for 10, and before then he'd been an advocate, so he always met that 20-year test of the public getting to know you. Do you think that might have been a problem for Kevin Rudd? That even though he was elected, quite a powerful mandate, they didn't really know him?
Look, no, I don't. In fact, I think this is with all due respect to your good self, one of the cute bits of media mythology that we get all the time. In fact, Ted Baillieu was the subject of an article in The Australian, I think, shortly after being elected, as the mystery man that nobody knows anything about. Now, to me, this is the media saying to its consumers,
we haven't figured him out.
We've got it's saying there's more to know about this person, so keep buying our newspaper. There's more to be revealed. Wait for the next exciting episode, and so you get this nonsense of people don't know them. Well, that's complete garbage. Like when you actually have someone like Kevin, who was kind of out there with extended exposure for quite a period of time, I'll tell you what, broadly the general public knew him as well as I did. You know, I was in the inner circle and so forth, because, and so you get this kind of phony mystery man phenomenon, you know, that somehow, somewhere there is a totally different human being hiding behind this persona that's out in the public area, and only if you keep buying our newspaper will you gradually see who this person is. It's complete garbage. You know, you do actually get to see in this country quite a lot about the individuals that are leading political figures. And sometimes if you're asking yourself the question, well, surely there's more, well, the answer is probably isn't. You know, you probably actually have seen all there is to see, and maybe that's disappointing, maybe it's not, who knows. But, you know, there's not much that's secret or mysterious about these individuals. And of course, the other thing is that there's always a big proportion of people who aren't paying attention. You know, and sometimes by choice. And so, you know, it used to drive me nuts when I was a shadow minister. I'd get Labor supporters writing into me saying, you know, why aren't you attacking the government about the waterfront dispute? And, you know, what Patrick's have done, and, you know, why are you silent? And I'd bite my tongue and say, well, here's the list of all the media I've done recently, and here's, you know, this, that and the other, and maybe you weren't tuned in to 3AW on this day and that day and this day. Maybe you weren't watching the Channel 2 news that day. Maybe you haven't read a newspaper for a month. But, yeah, actually I have been doing it. So don't underestimate the extent to which a very substantial proportion of people are kind of tuned out at any given time.
I just wanted to put in some additional information which might correct your view of the unknown Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was very well known to Queenslanders because he ran Queensland under Wayne Goss for many years. So I consider that Rudd had form on losing government, because when Goss fell, he was the most popular premier in the country on something like 70+%, and he lost an election. Keith de Lacy said on the Sunday morning, well, there's a message in there somewhere, but I don't know what it is. So, and yet there were sections of the union movement in Queensland who were refusing to vote for Goss. The railways in Townsville just refused. And so people in Townsville, a good Labor town at that stage, knew what was coming. No, I'm making information for people who only look for things in Victoria and New South Wales. There are other places.
We're running a national show here. This is a national event.
Well, I'd have to say a couple of things in response. One is there is a long history of some of my friends and colleagues in the more militant left unions in Queensland, particularly the rail unions, in opposing state Labor governments. In fact, that goes back to the 1920s, and in some cases, understandably. So that kind of tension predates Kevin Rudd by many decades, and I think you'll find there's a bit of that going on now, for example. So that is a given, I think, in Queensland state politics. Secondly, I think, as Tony Abbott did at the time, and John Howard and Peter Costello did at the time, the notion that somehow Kevin Rudd was running Queensland is fanciful. It sometimes suits politicians to let people think that the nasty things they're doing are actually being done by bureaucrats, because then they think the politician's not quite so bad and maybe might keep voting for them. So deflecting anger onto somebody like the head of the Cabinet Office or whatever Kevin was is sometimes quite useful. I'm not suggesting Wayne Goss necessarily did that, but it's kind of, you know, a very standard political misconception, or the sense that the politicians don't really know what's going on. Let me let you into a secret. Whether it's your local council, the state government, federal government, they all know exactly what's going on. It's just sometimes it suits them to pretend they don't. And sometimes people get sucked in by that. Politicians do actually know what's going on, but they're quite happy to avoid getting blamed by somebody who's unhappy about what's going on, and therefore the impression that they're sort of, you know, not really in touch with what's going on can be quite helpful at times. The other thing I'd say is that the critical thing that happened in the 2007 election with Kevin Rudd as leader of the Labor Party was that we won a giant swag of seats in Queensland. So I think that kind of answers the question. Whether rightly or wrongly, Queensland voted for, in droves, a Kevin Rudd-led Labor Party. So I think the idea that he was in some way on the nose in Queensland, or people had bitter memories of him in the Goss government, is simply not sustained by the evidence.
Sorry, hand go up there.
Hi. My question, at the very start you mentioned... At the very start you said that government and the media were locked in a bit of a death grip. I'm guessing there's no magic bullet, but whether you could comment at all on ways to untangle them, ways which might be good to untangle them?
Yeah, look, this is a very tricky problem, and I spent the last chapter of the book exploring possible things to do, and I think there is no simple solution to this. Market forces, I think, are showing signs of pressing back. So I regard the big increase in the Greens vote in the 2010 election last year as essentially a revolt of the educated classes against the inanity of mainstream political discourse and against standing up for Australia versus moving forward and everything that kind of stuff implies. And broadly parallel to the One Nation revolt of 12 or 13 years earlier, just from a very different segment of the community. I think the change in the media has positives and negatives, and none of us knows where the all the digital media is going to end up. I think there are some useful things that governments could do, but I think the notion that governments can get into this zone and start mandating things or interfering is extremely fraught for all kinds of obvious reasons, like freedom of expression and so on. But governments currently do subsidise the media in all kinds of ways. The amount of money that's spent on community broadcasting, for example, is about $6 or $7 million a year. Now, you might think that doesn't matter very much. Well, actually, community broadcasting is really important, does a great job. There's about 250 radio stations and half a dozen TV stations out there. They run on the smell of an oily rag. They're incredibly diverse. They're really important in many local communities. Increasing that amount of money would be a good thing. So there's things of that kind that could be done, but I think probably the most important thing is just, and this is why I've written this book, is just for people to be a bit more conscious of this, and therefore to put pressure back through the system as consumers and as voters, and that has an effect.
I'd like to ask you a question with a slightly more positive turn on the topic for tonight of smartening up democracy. Now, if I could take you back to the events of the 24th of June last year and contrast our constitutional framework with the Americans, where, of course, the only way to remove Barack Obama would be by the people at the ballot.
You're obviously a friend of his.
I do like the man, although not necessarily his policies, yes, thank you.
I wouldn't have the courage to call him Barry.
I've read so much of his work.
Clearly.
The only people who could remove Barack Obama would be himself if he resigned, and I won't say a la Nixon, but that was one example, or the judiciary. It wouldn't be open for the Deputy Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, to remove him. It would be unthinkable. Now, on the topic of smartening up democracy, I just wonder your views. Do you think that Australians, the people, will ever be smart enough or allowed to directly elect our own President or Prime Minister? And do you think that we would have a stronger constitutional government, a more democratic one, if we were to make those changes?
No system is perfect, and so essentially when you compare, as you're doing, a presidential system with a parliamentary system, in effect you face choices there between two different sets of strengths and weaknesses. And so it's very important to remember that you can choose something in isolation as a point of comparison between the two, where it's fairly clear that one is superior to the other. That doesn't mean that in aggregate that one is superior to the other. It is a much more complex thing than that. And I broadly remain a supporter of a parliamentary system of government, even though, for example, the the emergence, you might well quote Tony Blair's replacement with Gordon Brown. Who elected Gordon Brown, for example, in an equivalent light. But I think it's important to note that there are deficiencies in the presidential system as well. And the great thing, I think, about the parliamentary system is that you have stable, coherent government, typically, and you may think Australian government's not stable and coherent, but have a look around the rest of the world and you might change your mind, where broadly people kind of know what they're getting. Like, people go on about political parties and, you know, the tyranny of caucus and all this sort of stuff. Well, frankly, I think that's rubbish. I think the great thing about having parties is that people who, by and large, you know, won't be spending half their lives sort of finding out what everybody thinks about politics and so on, they got some idea of what they're voting for. So all of this palaver about independence and my conscience is all crap. You know, there is only one reason that I was a Member of Parliament for 17 and a half years, and that was because on the ballot paper that undoubtedly a number of people in this room got, it had Lindsay Tanner and then Australian Labor Party after my name. And that meant that people who were voting who'd never met me, the vast bulk of the people voting, who knew very little about me other than perhaps the odd leaflet in the letterbox or whatever, they had some idea of what I'd do. They had some idea of what their representative would stand for if he or she got elected. To me, that is a profoundly important thing in a democracy. And so the kind of presidential system, and that's just one point of comparison. The point I'm making is that in isolation, your observation may have some merit, but it's wrong to look at the comparison in isolation. You have to look at the total picture, and albeit acknowledging that there are strengths and weaknesses on either side, I would still prefer a parliamentary system as, I think, the better system. On the point of direct election, I would, by implication, not support direct election of a Prime Minister. I have been a supporter of a directly elected President of Australia since 1994, when I first asked myself the question, how should this be done? So I've been a direct electionist from day one, and I think eventually it will happen, but my great-great-grandchildren, I hope, will enjoy it when it does. Who knows when that moment will arrive? But I believe in that, not because I dislike the UK. I'm the biggest Anglophile in the country, I think. Not because I disparage the royal family or the thousands of years of history there, but because of a simple principle point, and that is that in a system of government, in a modern democratic society, all positions of any significance should be open to all citizens of that country, irrespective of race, birth, whatever. And by definition, our current arrangements breach that principle. And to me, that is a fundamental principle of any genuine democracy.
We've got one more.
Quick question, just in regards to a book you wrote many years ago. I think it was called Open Australia or something along those lines.
That's right.
How much do you think the dumbing down of the dissemination of information is a byproduct of a drop in civic participation and like political party membership and other kinds of civic participation?
I think that's a very significant part of it, and I think the key thing is that the range of intermediaries has shrunk. So in the world that I grew up in, you had unions, churches, service clubs, all kinds of community organisations that in some cases explicitly, more often implicitly, acted as political intermediaries. And so people took guidance, usually not instructions, but they took guidance from these intermediaries. And that's not a bad thing, as long as they still, they're not being instructed, go out and vote this way, vote that way, but they took guidance. The media, of course, were also collectively a very important intermediary. In effect, what's happened is that all those other intermediaries have shrivelled in influence and scale and participation, and the media have filled the vacuum. And so that decline of civic participation is, I think, a fundamental part of the picture. Now, it's not something that anybody can flick a switch and say, oh, you know, you've all got to go out and join your local Rotary Club or whatever. But it is, I think, a fundamental element in the changing nature of Australian society, which, amongst other things, makes people less engaged, more transient, more mobile. But it's a symptom of social change, not so much a cause. It's a symptom. But in this case, what it's done is remove a set of competing intermediaries that, in a sense, competed with the media and left the field pretty well open. And although, you know, like, they're still there, and there are other intermediaries that have emerged, you know, Greenpeace, for example, and so on, that do these things, I think that there's no doubt that civic society or civil society intermediation has, in overall terms, diminished very substantially. And so, yes, it's a problem. Don't ask me how to solve it, but I'd certainly say get out and participate in those things, and maybe it's going to go through a resurgence. I don't know.
You might think it's quite a simplistic view of things, but I actually wonder whether the 2007 election raised a whole lot of hope in the community, in fact, because the government actually, an opposition came to the media to present what appeared to be very substantial policy about how they were going to direct the course of Australian history and make it a fairer and more inclusive society. And I would argue, or put to you, and just hear your comments in return, is that in fact the disappointment that the community felt because those substantial policies were in fact not followed up are the reason why we're seeing this whole process of people being disenfranchised and not being engaged in the process. My feel going into that election was in fact that the community were desperately looking for engagement and involvement in the political process, and that they were actively looking at what was happening, but in fact they didn't find that in both of the parties that followed on after that point in time.
I don't think that's a simplistic point of view. I don't think that's a simplistic perspective at all. I don't think it's an accurate one. And in fact, of course, the most obvious response would be to go back to George's reference to Kevin Rudd and the government's poll ratings for the first 18 months. So if there was widespread disillusionment, it took an awful long time to start to emerge. I think, secondly, it's probably worthwhile to make reference to the facts that if you look at the key drivers of community sentiment at the time, they were, I'd suggest, work choices, climate change, Iraq, health reform, maybe one or two other things, and then a variety of still significant but probably less potent in terms of driving voter behaviour issues. Now, if you actually go through the list of things and then throw in a few additional things that nobody really anticipated, like a very big strategy with respect to homelessness, then I think the idea that somehow this was a government that, you know, kind of said all these big, bold, visionary things and then, you know, didn't really do very much, I think that's misconceived. Clearly, when you look at each individual one, you can identify grounds for debate, and you can argue that, you know, it didn't quite fulfil its commitment. And the most obvious controversial one is the climate change issue, which of course ebbed and flowed and went, you know, round in circles, and all kinds of things happened. But without wanting to sort of defend the government or be a commentator or whatever, I don't think that that narrative is sustained by the evidence, to be honest. And in fact, there is a counter-narrative, which I don't sign up to either, which is that people voted Labor and Kevin Rudd in because we promised to change very little and we were John Howard light. And in fact, one of the things that caused me enormous problems in my electorate and ended up with the Greens running me fairly close in 2007 was an ugly phrase you might recall called Me Tooism. Now, it strikes me as a little bit odd to suggest that on the one hand there was this kind of surge of, big social change promised by Labor at the 2007 election at the same time as we were endlessly being accused of Me Tooism, much to my electoral disadvantage in the seat of Melbourne. So I think, and I don't sign up to either narrative. I think inevitably it's messy, it's complicated, and I don't think you can generalise from either of those perspectives.
I've just got to ask you quickly, do you miss it?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We've sort of run a bit over time, but I couldn't wind him up any sooner, but thank you again.